1 second. I'm just making sure. There you go. For those of you joining us live online, welcome, or as we say out here in East Africa, Karibu. My name is Mushiri Nyaga from the Local Development Research Institute. We are part of the Data for Development Global Research Hub, also known as D4D.net. We'll be having conversations today on open data and AI as part of an effort to refresh the State of Open Data report that was done in 2019. Kind of bring it up to date and capture a bit more of the conversations that have happened since the publication. So without much further ado, because of time, I'd like to introduce Tim Davis. He's the chair for today's session. He's research director at Connected by Data, which is a nonprofit seeking to support communities at the heart of data governance. He was formerly co-editor of the State of Open Data, Histories and Horizons report, and he was Open Data Research Lead at the World Wide Web Foundation. He's a co-founder of Open Data Services Cooperative, a workers' co-op involved in developing and maintaining global data standards. And his research looks at the intersection of technology, democracy, and participation. He was a 2019 resident in AI at the Rockefeller Bellagio Center and helped to create the Global Data Barometer as an expert survey-driven study of data for the public good. So I'd like to invite you to come on now. Thank you very much, everyone. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Jerry, for that lovely intro, and welcome to everyone who is joining us. We've got a great panel with us this afternoon to explore how open data and AI meet and where the gaps are as well. Just to remind you, we're live streaming the session and we'll be using notes from the chat as well to inform updates to the state of open data. We're aiming for a respectful, constructive dialogue, but also a debate. There are many views on this topic of how open data and AI can interact for the public good and the different ways they interact. So we want that open discussion. I'd really encourage everyone who's here with us on Zoom to make use of the chat space and the Q&A. So if you've got a comment to share with each other, hopefully you should be able to chat message to everyone who's here. And if you've got a question you want to be put to the panel, you'll see there's a Q&A option at the bottom of the Zoom screen. For those of you following us on the YouTube live stream, you also have a chat box there. And hopefully someone will share on that page also a link to a Google Doc where you can share some notes. I can't promise we'll be following all the questions on the live stream, but I will try. But those people who are here in the room will try and get your questions into the panel. Inevitably, when we're on a technology topic, there might be acronyms, there might be mentions of projects that not everyone will know about. If we can all help each other by, if someone mentions an acronym that you can unpack, use the chat to do that as well. And as a bit of a starting question, because this is about our panel, but it's also about every participant who is here. If I could ask you all just to share in the chat your answer to what do you see as the connection between open data and AI in the work you do? So that's the housekeeping bits out the way, and hopefully we'll have your introductions. I'm going to ask my panel to turn their cameras on, and as they speak, you'll be able to see a little of them. I'll do brief intros, but their full bios, I think, are on the website. To just give a brief bit more background, the State of Open Data report, it was 3 years ago that we launched it, about 5 years ago that we started writing this sort of vast compendium book on what's happening in open data in over a decade of practice. And I had the pleasure of working on the AI chapter, but also editing the collection as a whole. And one of the things we really looked for there is, where is the evidence of algorithmic processing, machine learning, or AI applications using open data? And I was surprised to find relatively little deep practice. There's lots of rhetoric around open data being an engine for AI, lots of presence of open data. Almost any AI strategy I looked at sort of talks about opening data and opening government data as an intervention to pursue. but I saw relatively little evidence of that being used or large-scale kind of innovations happening with that data. We also saw those live debates that have only grown more to the forefront of how we're concerned about issues of bias, concerned about the social impacts of AI coming up. And we raised the question in the 2019 chapter of what role open data plays in addressing some of those gaps and challenges. So those are some of the themes I'm coming in to explore, but I want us in this session with your comments from participants, the questions we ask, and our panelists to really look at what are all the things that should be on the table when we explore these intersections. So what I'm going to start by doing is asking each of our speakers just to briefly introduce themselves and to introduce what open data and AI mean to them. What are the connections in their work? And then we're going to go to some questions I've got for the panelists, and then we'll come to your questions. So as questions occur to you, put them in that Q&A tool and we'll bring them in. So I'd like to come first to Renata Avila, who is Chief Executive of Open Knowledge, but also involved in so many projects across the technology, openness, social justice space, including the fund. So Renata, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Basically, you know, like when I think of this, is I go back to my origins in Guatemala, you know, and I play an analogy in my head. And basically is what, you know, peasants agriculture does, basically. Open data is the good seed that will, you know, like give birth to good crops and feed people, nourish people in a good way. That's the way I see it, you know, like if we have open data or high quality, open data is the minimum, you know, is the bare minimum that will help us grow different systems that will, at the end of the process, help people to, like, you know, live better lives. And as opposed to that, you know, like closed data, I compare it, you know, like with the transgenic, you know, seeds that impede reproduction, impede localization, adaptation, natural adaptation to local circumstances, and in the end, you know, can you know, like be the triggers when you cannot pay all the things that you have to pay to have access to these seeds, to famine, to, you know, to decrease of quality of life. So playing that analogy, I would say that open data is the sine qua non factor to have the AI we want in the future, to have an AI that is accountable, an AI that we can, like, you know, shape, an AI that can be collaborative, an AI that can be, like, you know, like purposed for the public good, even if it's serving the private sector or the academia or government as well. So it's the precondition, is a necessary precondition for any AI system that would be like a fair, accountable, and sustainable.
Fantastic. Thanks, Renata. That sets us off in a really good tone of a strong view of the essential role of open data. I'd like to come next to Dr. Feng from Open Data China, again, involved in many projects exploring this space. Feng.
Thank you, Tim. I think we started the work of open data back to 2014 and always on the line searching and creating more chance for open data existed in China. And from my view, that if, let's say, if we want to build more powerful AI, we need more data, and open data is a means to supply those data. And on the other hand, if we really fear of the day that one day we will create a sky network, and the weapon we are going to fight against this kind of powerful AI is also to require more open data. So this is the way we can assure that openness is embedded in the process of creating this kind of powerful machine. So that's actually how the open data is linked with the AI development. It's as an engine to really advance the development, but also it's an interesting weapon we have to also defend the future of the humanity as well.
Fantastic, thank you, Feng. The driver and the defense to AI presented. Next, and thanks to my panel for really brief, sort of sharp intros. This is great. To Jenny Tennyson, CEO of Connected by Data, formerly the Open Data Institute, but also on the Data Working Group, chairing the Data Working Group of the Global Partnership on AI. Jenny, what does this connection look like to you?
Thanks very much, Tim. Yeah, so you mentioned the kind of two hats that I bring to this and kind of think around. So one is wearing the hat of being on the Data Governance Working Group at the Global Partnership on AI, which is all around fostering responsible development of AI grounded in principles of human rights, inclusion, diversity, innovation, and economic growth. And there, as the co-chair of that group, I think the focus on data governance often has this focus on shutting things down, on stopping access, on preventing harms due to privacy harms and so forth. And one of the things that I really wanted to bring into that group was also to focus on governance as being a process of opening things up, right? It's about finding the right kinds of levels of openness for data. So that's one angle that I come at it from, and then the other angle that I come at it from is from the Connected by Data angle, which is supported by me being a Shuttleworth Foundation Fellow, and is really focusing on putting communities at the heart of our data narratives and practices and processes. And the angle there is that when we are creating AI, we're often using that off the back of aggregate data that is about sets of people. And because of that, then it has community impacts, which means that we should have community governance over it. And just reflecting back on Renata's point, when we introduce that better level of governance, in particular include communities in that, then we need more openness and more transparency, because those around the creation of AI, because that will, and its impact, because that is what people will need to make decisions around in order to tell whether a particular approach is something that you want to pursue or not. So there's both the kind of data as a source, as we've talked about, and also data as a kind of check and balance and way of providing transparency.
Fantastic, thank you, Jenny. So I'm going to come to each of our panel now, starting with an optimistic perspective on AI and putting aside for the moment many of the critical arguments that get made about how AI is currently practiced. And I want to ask each of you in turn just to reflect on, when you look at AI essentially as applying a particular set of algorithmic approaches to analyze data and make use of it, can you paint a picture of some of the particular social challenges you think this can help us address today, and ways in which open data plays into that? So that could be a hypothetical or a real world example that's on your mind. And I think I'll go through in the same order. So coming to you first, Renata.
Oh my God, like, Tim, all my life I have been the first, because I'm Avila with A. That algorithm needs to be changed, why A was decided to be the first, of the alphabet. Anyway, there's many positives. I mean, I co-founded the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms, and I co-founded that. I love AI. I love the possibilities of technology. I love the possibilities of people seizing the power of technology to solve the most, challenging problems of our times. And I think that, that as usual, as it happens with other technologies, what it worries me is the disparities, north and south. And that, like always, it is the global north that eats the cake, and the global south only cleans the table, basically, after the cake has been eaten. But that can be different, I think that the report and many of the networks, practitioner networks and research networks that we are part of indicate we can really work on a different way and accelerate the transfer of skills and accelerate the transfer of capacities. So like a little bit like Tim Berners-Lee, that, you know, like a little bit like his vision. This can be for everyone. And I think that that's I think that what we are doing at the Open Knowledge Foundation, and we are thinking of is, okay, let's take the most pressing challenge of our times: climate change, climate crisis. We describe it as climate crisis, not change. You know, what if we seize all the computational power and the brain power and the local knowledges combined to produce the AI and, you know, predictions and modeling that will help us save the planet? So that's the direction where my thoughts are going, but that cannot be possible without public data, publicly open data, and private sector data being open, and scientific data being open.
Yeah, real focusing on that climate issue being kind of critical to our time. Jenny, are there particular social challenges you see as ripe for or where action's already taking place?
So you're disrupting the order here. Thanks for that, Tim. So yeah, just building on the climate action piece, there was a report that came out from GPay last year looking specifically at the role of AI in addressing climate action. And I think it broke it down quite nicely and quite helpfully. It identified 4 areas where AI can really help around climate action. So one was distilling raw data into actionable information. So for example, analysing satellite imagery to pinpoint deforestation or areas of cities vulnerable to coastal inundation. Second was improving predictions. So for example, providing minute level forecasts of solar power generation to help balance the electrical grid, or predictions of agricultural yield with extreme weather. So I'm trying to get concrete on these examples because I think it's helpful. The third was optimizing complex systems. So for example, managing the energy needs to heat and cool buildings, for example, or complex freight transportation schedules so that you get those kind of aligned and therefore reduce your transportation and carbon costs associated with them. And then there's the accelerating scientific modeling and discovery. So the kind of standard stuff around accelerating research and innovation and those kinds of things. So those are the kind of optimistic things around climate action. We also did a report about a year earlier in the data governance working group looking at, so where is data actually used for AI and how can it and where can it focus? And there were a couple of places. Obviously that was in kind of 2020, and so attention was very much on pandemic, so and use in health, so diagnosis based on open imagery, drug discovery based on trials data, some of which can be open and some of which really can't, right? And having those kind of epidemiological data and models and predictions. But then one that I really like and kind of I think has some very interesting kind of qualities around it was AI for developing human language technologies, so enabling automated translation. I was on a very interesting panel yesterday where we talked a bit about that, and one of the members of the panel who was from the Latinx community was talking about how automated translation was actually enabling participation for communities that would otherwise be excluded from those conversations. So there's something about the AI just helping us work together better, which I think is really, really valuable. Anyway, I'll leave it with that. And
fantastic. And I realized I went off my order because I went across the people on my screen, but we'll mix the order up and have a new algorithm or a random sort for the next questions. Feng, though, what's your sort of optimistic take on where AI and open data can take us?
Well, I must say it's really difficult job to answer this question after these 2 wonderful answers from Jenny and Renata. But I would like to say that I still have a very strong faith in AI plus health, especially like Jenny mentioned that for drug discovery, especially for rare disease. I still remember that network like patients like me, their data are valuable for this kind of stuff. But also I think in the past 2 or 3 years, we see a great progress in using AI and data for early diagnosis of cancers. and under some disease. So I think this is really promising, and it's really useful in this real society. But if we think more widely, and if we think about that the intersection of open data and AI, and if we think about the core value of openness, I think one of the interesting things is that if openness stands for more collective wisdom from the grassroots, then is it possible that we use this kind of wisdom from the grassroots to create the best government we can have ever get before? So that becomes the engine to really make a decision, but also govern the society for the general good. So is it possible? I'm not sure, but I think this is an interesting vision we should have. It's not for dream, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Feng. So if I can invite everyone who's on the call, start thinking about your questions that you'd like to put to the panel, or your comments as well. Thanks to the few people who've gone into the Google Doc to share what they see as the connection between open data and AI. And I'll post that link again in a moment, because I really want to get your thoughts and inputs. But I'm now going to go with a specific question to each of our panel. And I think, Jenny, I'll come to you first on that, which is to dig into institutions that help us interface open data into AI, because as your past work at the Open Data Institute kind of explored, it's not a simple binary anymore. It's not just open and closed. There's a data spectrum, and under the global partnership, I think there's been a lot of work on what are the institutions that can take the data as well from the private sector, as Renata mentioned, and make that more accessible, that can take some of this maybe more sensitive data about health, patient records, and open it as far as possible. So yeah, I'd just like to invite you to say a bit more about where you see these new structures fitting into the landscape, where in the past we've tended to be quite binary about open and closed.
Cool, thanks, Tim. Yeah. So for me, then the attention on the institutional mechanisms for enabling more sharing, like even if that's not completely open data, kind of arose out of just looking at some of the big challenges that we've been needing to face around open data. So one is that often the openness of data is really at the behest and beneficence of the organizations that are collecting data, and they're not always generous. So we talked about private sector and access to private sector data, for example. So that means that there's a real need to bring other interests into the equation in order to satisfy the broader kind of goals that we might have around data that's being collected. The second kind of challenge around existing open data was around sustainability and reliability. So the frequency with which open data projects fall into disrepair. And if you're thinking about actually using data on an ongoing basis, then you really need to have something that is sustainable and reliable that you can continue to go back to again and again and again. And then the third challenge was really around collaboration. So I think that open data is at its best when it's bringing together the efforts of multiple people and organizations, things like citizen science initiatives, or things like OpenStreetMap, or pre-competitive data spaces where private sector organizations or even charities are sharing data. Okay, so those are the kind of challenges, but in order to meet those, I think institutions are a really interesting kind of intervention. So you need somebody to steward this data, including open data, but particularly when it's data that has some more sensitivity around it, to coordinate collaboration, to have independence, so you have the balance of interests. And they need to be institutional because they need to be long-term, they need to be sustainable, they need to not be projects that are going to fail after a couple of years. And when we looked at this, and there are lots of different kind of types of institutions, there are and they already exist, right? Our old-fashioned public sector institutions, national statistics offices, mapping agencies, meteorological offices are institutional stewards of data, a lot of whom have moved to open data because of the kind of stuff that they hold. But we also see existing institutions, existing organizations that are gradually growing into their data power, is the way I like to think of it. You know, they're starting to steward data on behalf of communities that they already have. And we've got a huge amount of interest in the data governance community about new types of institution that are being set up. So that's where things like data trusts and data unions really come in, which have different kinds of governance models associated with them, different kinds of ways of making decisions. You know, GPay, we did a lot of work of this and still doing a lot of work of this at the Open Data Institute. At GPay, we look particularly at these bottom-up examples like data trusts, where it's individuals donating data into some kind of pool. There's a report on that that's specifically focused on how to do that for climate action. There are some challenges around it as well, in particular that bottom-up model, and in particular in getting the kind of volume of contribution that is going to make a difference and going to be meaningful, particularly against the kind of private sector sets of data and kind of volumes that they have. But I do think that that institutional focus is a really valuable one in thinking about how we address those other kinds of challenges around making open data actually meaningfully available for AI and other purposes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jenny. I'm going to come to Renata next, building on some of those institutions that we need to make AI work better for us. Now, you're on the one of the advisory groups, I think, of the steering committee of Lacuna Fund, which is been creating new data sets. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit about how that work and other work you're involved in is kind of filling gaps and driving great.
At the end, we have two converging inequalities. One is, knowledge inequality, I mean, we don't have enough engineers and funding for research everywhere. And the second is data inequality. One of the things that I'm exploring at the Open Knowledge Foundation is, for example, when one thing is, okay, asking you government, open me the data, I need to know. A very different thing is produce the data. You need to produce some sort of data set because I don't know, we don't know, nobody knows, but that can be known and is key to solve the most pressing problems of our times. So basically, that's a little bit what Lacuna Fund is doing, is trying to proactively cultivate, as it was like the seed spreader of these data sets, the critical data sets we need. And basically how it works, Lacuna Fund, is it was intended initially, to be just funder club, basically, a group of funders deciding where to allocate the money. And it turned into something far more complex and fascinating. Basically, it's a multi-stakeholder group in the good way of multi-stakeholderism, actually, that includes people who understand the complexities on language, on climate, on agriculture, on health, on technical issues, and can advise where the efforts will be more valuable. I'm part of the steering committee. I'm not part of a specific thematic group, but there's a collective basically of technical people with an global understanding and local knowledges that when we put them in common can allocate funds, people, and actions in combining the three to make the impact we want, basically. And right now, sorry about the infomercial, there's an open climate call of proposals is due on the 17th. I will drop the link because I think many of the people attending this call will be highly eligible probably to apply for that Lacuna funding. And I mean, I think that it is a very interesting model that can lead to similar models, to combat, global hunger, or to combat other, gender and race inequalities and so on.
Thanks, Renata. And I'm going to come to Feng now and take a slightly different track on looking at the geopolitics of AI a little bit, because a lot of debates on AI focus about comparisons between the EU, the US, China, and try and not build a commons, but build this kind of competitive angle of different states building their data and AI economies. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, looking at building an open data and AI space in China, how you see that playing out.
Yes, so first of all, I would like to give audience some backgrounds, necessary context. So first, the fact is that China does have open government data that I think since 2014, the government already set up like nearly 200 different open data portals to releasing open government data. And secondly, open data is kind of defined differently in China. So originally it is follow the open definition, or at least similar to the open definition. But after the introduction of AI, I think in around 2017 or 18, open data in China covers both the open data, but also the generally speaking, the data sharing parts on the data spectrum. So it should be really careful when someone in China tells you we have open data, you need to really unpack what it really means. And secondly, I think open data in China, it is considered as a way to increase the data supply for AI development. And especially the government consider it's a way to supply the data to only the selected giants, but also promoting AI startups for economic reasons. So it's kind of not surprising that the government choose to use open data, but also other ways as much more safe and controlled methods to provide the data to those AI development. And I think it's interesting to point out that in China, we still do not really see a strong release of open data, or let's say public data sets from the private sector and the research institutions. At least they are publishing some of the data for academic reasons, but most time those data are released under restricted license, which prohibits for commercial use, or it does not allow you for directive use on top of the data set. Another thing I'd like to highlight is if we think about the transparency and accountability of the AI development, we see currently in China, open data is missing in the conversation to build a much more responsible AI. While it is possible to use open data to call for much transparency on the input of the AI system, but I don't really see this conversation happens in China yet. So it is interesting that we see there's an opportunity to really push for a new narrative of what open data means for the AI development, but also for this kind of digital governance in China, to link not only the economic goals with the AI and the data release, but also link the social agenda on the transparency, collaborative, also possibly participatory, those agenda with the AI development, with the open data agenda. So this is my 2 cents from the observation in China.
Fantastic, thank you, Feng. And I'd love to invite everyone on the webinar. If you've got perspectives from your national context that you could add into the kind of discussion, please do pop those in chat. We're starting to get a few questions, but I'd love to get a few more questions from attendees before I go to that section of our panel. So I've got one more question I'm going to put to all our panelists, and I think I'm going to let them turn on their cameras and jump in whichever order they like. So hopefully it won't be silence after I've asked this, but is really picking up on that idea of data, open data as a defense against the worst of AI and as a tool to shift the balance of power in how AI systems are developed and deployed. And I'm really curious what the panel see as is this a realistic hope against the kind of vast power of some private AI systems? Is open data really that tool for us? And if it is, where are the signs of hope we should be building on to really realize that kind of participatory, collaborative vision that Feng was outlining? Go ahead, Renata, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think that it is beginning. It's not enough. We learned that the hard way, when we were very naively embracing openness without other, principles together with it to calibrate our decisions. We crashed, basically. Sorry about using we crashed title. Like basically what happened was like that we enabled the growth of giants without keeping their power tamed. Open data is openness and open knowledge as a design principles is basic, but it cannot be the only principle that guides us. Equality, is fairness. And I know that it sounds a little bit abstract, but equality, fairness, feminism, sustainability, democratic governance. We cannot do open for the sake of open. It has to come as a combination of values that communities are embracing and practicing, so as to deliver the artificial when we talk about artificial intelligence and all of this, we are talking about the systems of the future. I mean, we had in the past constitutions, to guide us in how the world was going to function. Now we have a combination of the static code, our constitutions, our human rights, bodies, and the dynamic embodiment of that is the way that we behave in society, but also very soon the way that systems will apply that code of rules of society in digital. So it cannot be just openness. Is of course a seed of hope, and it's a radical change from the structures of the past that were governed by secrecy, exclusivity, and elitism. But it has to be assisted by other principles.
Great. Who'd like to come in next?
I'm happy to. I think just building on what Renata was saying, we do need to recognize that openness in the face of existing severe power differentials just exacerbates those differentials, right? When you have organizations, big corporates, big governments that both have access to more data and have access to more skills and have access to more opportunities to use that data, then more data is going to just make things worse rather than better. I wanted to try and grasp at some kind of places where I think that there is some interesting work. So I mentioned earlier on about natural language processing and translation, and I think that Common Voice from Mozilla Foundation is a really interesting example of open data, specifically trying to tackle a particular power differential, namely that there's a lot more language data that can be used by the big corporations than there is openly, and they're trying to address that need by having a more kind of collective approach at building these corpora, and also a more equitable approach at building these corpora by specifically targeting smaller languages that have where there's less data available currently, and really going out of their way to make their data sets be more just and more equitable. So I think that that's a really interesting example. I do think that there are specific challenges with openness when we're looking at it for the purposes of AI, right? Because we often have very sensitive data sets. That includes like health records, it includes transport patterns, it includes things like satellite imagery. All of these things are actually quite sensitive data. You can reveal quite a lot about people from them. And because they're used in quite kind of global ways, then the harms from them are that much larger as well. And as we've been learning over the past few decades, then we can see that there are places where particular minoritized communities, indigenous populations, are exploited in these relationships and need and deserve to have sovereignty and protect and to have control over the particular data they're talking about. And all of those factors mean that pure openness, proper open data with no restrictions becomes something that is rarer and rarer that we can have, and we start to need to have these much more kind of subtle conversations around who gets access, for what purpose, under what constraints, and how do we even check that in the end as well. So yes, I think that we are right to have learned from. We are right as an open data community to learn from what we have seen actually happen, rather than keep dreaming for what our original dream was, and to try to adjust for that and to try and find those places. I will say that we mustn't let go of the openness dream as well, right? Because I think that there are specific reasons why openness and lack of restrictions unlocks creativity to a level that other things don't. But we do have to recognize these broader kind of impacts that we've seen in terms of power, and really try and address those as well.
Thank you, Jenny. Feng, do you have some thoughts to add?
Yeah, I would like to, just speaking of a very specific context in China or other countries similar to China, that with a much tradition of closed development. So that we're seeing that open data probably will have much more room to grow and survive if we can change the way we are thinking about how we develop. Because you probably know that as Chinese, we are thinking that a development is by plan. So that our government have 5-year plan, 10 years plan, so that everything is according to plan. And in this context, you don't need open because everything is there, already set there. Well, we need open is because it creates uncertainty, right? And uncertainty creates beauty for innovation, for discovery, and all those great discovery in the human history are by chance. They are not by the plan. So I think it's necessary to change the way we are thinking about how we develop, not only for AI, but as a digital world, how we develop. Then we need to really embrace the value of the open so we can see how open data play an important role in this society. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jenny, do come back on that if you want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that because I really agree, and it was one of the kind of great lessons from the pandemic was for me was in a situation where we had great uncertainty. That was precisely when we needed more openness, because we couldn't rely on our tacit knowledge or our plans about what the future might hold. And so the kind of we needing to make more rapid kind of decision cycles meant that more openness was suddenly a real advantage for us to be able to navigate those kinds of difficulties. And if we look forward into the future, there are going to be even more of those, right? That they're going to be, we're heading into even more uncertainty, particularly because of climate change and the climate crisis. So I think that forms a very good basis for arguing for open in the way that you described, Feng. I thought that was really good.
Thank you. We've started to get some questions in from the chat, so I'm going to go pick on those in not the order they came in, but I will try and get to them all. Please do post more questions or observations in. I'd hoped we'd be in a web meeting where I could bring people on to voice their questions, but I'm going to have to pose them for you because of the format we're in. But Thomas Linder, I think, is asking us a question that rather flips the discussion on its head from saying open data feeding into AI to say, what are we seeing of how AI is pushing our understanding of how to design and build open data sets, or build open algorithms, or build governance and democratic participation. But particularly interesting for me is that question of actually, does AI change the way we even create and supply open data to the world in future. And I don't know if any of you would like to pick up on that or the broader question there.
Very quickly, but I want the others to respond. Of course, it changes everything, it changes everything, and it also changes our interaction with it. We need new rules, and we need not to repeat the same mistakes that locked innovation away from us. I think that as we start interacting and co-creating with artificial systems, and that's my, wearing my many hats of an advocate for open innovation, we really need to be very flexible in this way, because it will be a very different relationship. And then, those who concentrate power and wealth will come, oh, it's copyrighted. Oh, no, this belongs to the one who paid the funding behind the AI system. We must avoid that at all costs, because I think that is, the idea of the future that we have been sold recently is very apocalyptic, including AI, robots will kill us. I have a very different idea and perception, but it depends on the rules of the game. If the rules of the game will enable humans, will enable us to seize the power of these new systems, and data will be a key component of that, because we are contributing actively to very, very precious data sets that will shape this, then it can be different. So in short, a note of hope, not naive, but a note of hope. If different the systems that are configured in a different way.
Feng or Jenny, Jenny, go ahead.
Yeah, happy to. So trying to think about places where we might learn from AI. One of the things that I've that of course has been developed as part of looking in particular at fairness and transparency and equity around AI is model cards, right? So enhanced kind of metadata around data sets. And I think that that's a really interesting thing for us to learn from more broadly for open data, in that those kinds of approaches are specifically searching out and looking for and documenting into a high degree of specificity aspects of bias and issues and problems, potential impacts, in a way that, if I think back to 10 years ago when we were doing kind of open data portals at that point, metadata wasn't really focused on the potential harms that could come from that data or where its biases were. It was much more focused on just describing what it was, So I think that there are some things around the recognition of those kinds of harms and broader impacts that come from the use of data at scale within AI, that we can learn then about, actually this applies to a lot more data than just data that we're using for AI. We have to be a lot more critical about the way in which we're looking at the data that's even small data and that is just using basic algorithms or in the basic kind of digital tooling that we have, and the way in which that has those kinds of knock-on harms. So yeah, learning more about how to think through what harms and impacts look like and how to document them, I think is something we could take.
Feng.
One of the lessons we learned from especially seeing how the AI data set are created. If you look at a paper published by Google, I think 1 year or 2 years ago at Europe, that it identifies saying 50% of the data set released in the AI training or benchmark are only published by 12 top universities or giants. So I think it's a very interesting problem, that how could we introduce more, let's say, alternative methods to govern those data sets, as only those young or the top universities, they can't really ensure the diversity and the equitable and all other values we chase in the data sets. And we need a new way to think about how to govern those kind of public actors, because they are powering the public instruments that created for service for the social service that powered by the AI. And we need to think about how those kind of power shift, not just only on dataset creation, but also how it creates new power imbalance in the AI service development and also the consequences of those AI systems. So I think that's one of the things we should really seriously think about how we go forward.
Fantastic. Some real themes coming out there about the in a sense the culture of openness and learning about how we apply that to the whole stack of AI development and think much more critically about what that then tells us when we open the box of what's going on. What do we start to see about the biases, the issues, and what ways do we address that? I think there's also an interesting theme here in the simple production of data, that it's no longer structured data no longer comes solely from people typing it into a data set, but can be created by AI processes, and that potentially opens a whole new set of issues and questions that get into Renata's theme on the copyright issues. All the intellectual property issues that were there at the early genesis of open knowledge movements come back to the fore, because we need not only open data, but open content from which we can generate structured data that we can then kind of analyze. I want to come though to a question. I'll try and pronounce your name correctly, but I apologize if not, from Uladari Adegan in the Nigerian Institute for Oceanography and Marine Research in Lagos, who's asking about how developing nations can benefit from what's going on. He frames it in terms of what's going on in developed countries in terms of capacity building and developing capacity around AI. And so I think essentially the question is around, and Renata's touched on this already, that kind of knowledge transfer or that building more equitable capacity. So I'm curious if any of you are seeing particular interventions or particular things that should be happening to lead to a more globally distributed capacity on AI. Jenny.
I was looking at Renata, and Renata was looking at.
Yes, it's like, hey, I don't know, like go ahead, Jenny, and then I follow.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the disparities in capacity are, and it's not just in capacity, it's in terms of human resources. It is also in terms of capacity, in terms of digital resources and infrastructure, right? It's also to do with whether you've got local compute power, whether you've got internet connectivity, whether you've got access to electricity all the time. Like, all of these issues are real challenges for people who are working in Africa on AI. The bit that I mean, there's lots of kind of standard development kind of things that you could answer around those. The bit that I'm finding interesting and that we're working on in Connected by Data is how to get to some of the more participative methods of governing data as a way of building agency and empowerment, and actually making the development of those kinds of tools more relevant to the communities that they're going to be being affected. So giving more power and voice to the communities that are going to be actually using data in order to not actually need to follow the same kind of models as have been focused on in the global north. And so I think that there are opportunities around having that more bottom-up, community-oriented, participatory kinds of models that could be used in those kind of contexts, and that there is an advantage in using that in particularly Africa contexts, but also elsewhere in the world, where the individualistic kind of notions that we have in the West aren't so deeply embedded, where there's a more kind of collective model of what good looks like, and the way in which different kinds of models for governance and different kinds of ways of working together. So for me, then that's I'm sure there's lots of standard kinds of capacity building type things to be done, and I think that that's right, but I'm really interested in how it can build on the existing strengths of the communities within Africa to get something that's different too.
And I want to add, I want to add that very, very quickly, I often do not romanticize the global south, we have as the global, no, there's disparities and, economic inequalities and so on, but it's not that our, dynamics locally are perfect ever. But I think that the combination, the best of many places put in combination. And when we share in equal terms what is best from our communities, and I have discovered that, for example, in Guatemala, where I come from, we have excellent dynamics on, taking care of managing natural commons that could be transpolated to manage digital commons. And I know that, in many countries, Canada, Germany, and so on, they have very sophisticated and very good data structures. I mean, even SICAN, that comes from Open Knowledge Foundation, that was mostly coded in the north, but deployed in places in the south. Is the combination we need to stop thinking that a good data strategy and AI strategy relies only on technology and spreadsheets. It is about people, it is about interdisciplinarity, it is about political will, it is about accountability, it's about rules of the game. So I guess that, we have a lot to learn from Africa, because, what, a little bit like Central America, when people are cheating the system, far quicker than many of the super, compliant countries will notice. How to engage communities. We know many, is the collection of different pieces of knowledge and the combination of it that will make, the systems of the future that we dream of. Because it's not only silly, it's unnatural not to be combining these different, now we have, never before we had the possibility to combine these different dispersed pieces of knowledge. We have it now. So that's where my hope is more of collaboration and cooperation and partnerships, rather than, help me, plug and play. Yeah.
Feng, do you want to add anything on
that? I just wanted to add that there are so many interesting programs for capacity building at the community level, for grassroots, for journalists. But I just thinking, is there any program, fellowship program or capacity program for policymakers to be trained on the value of community, the value of openness, that really lets them to immersively experience why it's important to take these parts of openness and community-driven hackathons, creativeness from the community. I think very often they don't really understand that, but they can easily understand the concept of saying publication of the data to make it available. Those are technical issues. They can easily understand that, but the cultural part, they never really understand it. And that's why it's usually failed at the government level to do open data or create a more open ecosystem for tech development. Yeah.
A really key point, and taps in perhaps to that earlier theme of the generative and uncertainty space is one that's often very difficult or culturally hard for governments and others and to work with, yet is in dealing with some of the challenges we named earlier, where technology could help is going to be crucial. Maybe I'd put you on the spot, Renata. I know you've been working with UNESCO, I think, on some of their capacity building on AI. Do you think they'll be bringing in that cultural piece, or is it very much on the technical side?
It is, it is very interesting because it's still there for everybody to shape it. We are doing consultations with Global South on. It is almost the impossible question. If you want to reinvent the public service, civil servants, which skills they should have, and recurrently in the conversations, as my previous answer, it's not about tech. It's not about them being able to code. It is about understanding the potential, the dangers, the possibilities, and taking and generating. And that's not a skill allocated in an individual. Generating within the institutions the environment that will enable them to, like, you know, to combine different elements to, like, you know, to produce the technologies that we want to see. And I think that the second thing that in the consultations we have heard over and over and over again, it is about serving people. It is about technology, data, and everything at the service of people, especially the most vulnerable, but everybody as well. You know, like, we want to deal, we have the possibility for the first time in our lives to have this seamless, this nice relationship with our state. And we are missing out, you know, like, because of, because of poor design, poor, like, engagement of the relevant stakeholders and so on. To me, that's the magic, you know, like, if I have to deal with less, if I have to spend less time of my life filling forms, and, you know, if I have to, if especially the most vulnerable have to spend less time of their lives, you know, dealing with an oppressive state that, you know, discriminates and so on, and deals with a system that is smooth and serves well, we will have more time to address other problems. We will like get lucky in having time liberated and in having, like, a quality of life improved by the systems. That was the end goal, really. And we need to go back to the narrative, and we need to go back to the narrative that is possible. And as this panel says, open data and good quality data is the departing point, basically.
Thank you, Renata. So we've hit the hour. I know some of our attendees drop off this session, scheduled for another half hour or so. But I think what we're going to try and do is just wrap up in the next 15 minutes by turning to the big picture, to what is the state of open data and AI. I'm going to put in the chat again a link to the Google document that we've got a few notes in, not many, but I'd invite everyone to follow that link if you can, and to collectively map out what are some of these strengths or weaknesses, opportunities and threats of where we are right now. And looking ahead, you know, the State of Open Data book looks at a decade of open data. We're 5 years on from that review starting. We're at the, you know, where are we? We've got not many years till our SDG target should be met. We're 8 years out from the Sustainable Development Goals and a vision of a more just world. AI and open data have been seen as tools in that. So what as we look ahead are the things we need to be focusing on? And what I'm going to ask our panelists to do is we'll go round one round of our panel. I'll start with Feng, Renata, and then Jenny. And as I go around them, I'll ask them to maybe give a strength and a threat, or a weakness or an opportunity, just 2 things for that grid. But all of you who are attendees as well, please do add your own thoughts into that document as we go. So I've already forgotten the order I said I'd go. I think I said I'd come to Feng first. So over to you.
Yes, I think the great challenges or threats to open data in AI is possibly just as I said, that people usually simply consider it as a means to supply data, rather than consider it a way to governing AI or to improve the AI transparency accountability. So we needed to change the narrative of open data. We needed to make it much more clear to policymakers, to practitioners in AI sector, to understand the value of open data is not just simply giving you more data, but just trying to make the AI much accountable, participatory, and trustworthy. I think this is one of the great challenge, and it takes time. And also, it's really hard to do it in very different contexts. So it requires a global collaboration to see how we can change this culture, change this kind of narrative altogether. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
A threat is the narrative of doom, you know, like, okay, we will, like, the world is going to end, we are not going to achieve anything, and data lords are going to, like, be controlling us like puppeteers. We must reject strongly that narrative, we need to we need, especially us, we know the potential. And we know the democratic potential of openness that can drive, innovation, and can seed communities, and can open the possibility, can really unlock the possibility for people to invent new words, invent new solutions, collaborate together, and so on. So narratively wise, we need to move from it is not possible, they won the race, there's no alternative digital realities that we could build, and we need to bring back the narrative of hope. That's I think. And one positive side, today on this planet we have the most educated generation that ever existed. We have the most numerous number of educated young people ever, and connected and aware and embracing environmental politics and feminist politics. I have all the hope that we are prepared like never before to seize the power of technologies for not only saving the planet, but making it a better and more just place. So look at the numbers. I mean, for the people who love data, never before countries in the global south had so many people in university, in high school, in primary school, never before there were so many literate people, connected people. That's something that we should be celebrating and realizing as a power, as an asset that will help us advance our goals.
Fantastic. So both threats, opportunities, and strengths there onto the map. Jenny.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to build on Renata's strength that she was mentioning, their opportunity. I do think that new generation that is just used to building on each other's work, because they're digital natives, they create TikToks of each other, create animatics of each other. They have these kinds of very generative fandoms that they're part of. I think that there is a real strength and opportunity there that we could do better to tap into. And that related to the kind of strength that I was going to say, which is a kind of counterpart to what Feng mentioned. I think that there's a strength in the open movement in general around working together and collaboration that is actually something that can be brought into AI and should be something that they want to draw on for all of the kind of reasons that we've discussed around taking advantage of innovation and adapting to new circumstances and all those kinds of things. So I think that we should view that kind of open culture as a real strength. I do want to touch on a weakness, which I mentioned earlier, but around the strong line between what's open and what isn't open, what's only shared, and the kinds of subtleties that we need around the reuse of particular assets that we've found that we need to have around the reuse of those assets. I don't think we've found the right ways of getting the benefits of openness in terms of bringing data together, in terms of combining resources and so forth. The benefits of true openness are through proper unrestricted open licenses that enable that kind of really generative reuse, while still respecting the other kinds of rights and the other kinds of and being aware of the other kinds of impacts that we might be concerned about. So things like thinking through what only using data for ethically good purposes, for example, seems to be something that people want to be able to specify in their licenses, but it's very, very difficult to do and to define. And I think that's a current weakness that we need to work on, particularly in the use of AI, which is one of the reasons why I think public participation is a promising kind of approach, because it provides a process approach to tackling that weakness.
Thank you, Jenny. And I think for me, there's something that really resonates with some of Feng's earlier comments as well around how open data's played out in China, how it has in different countries, that we've not, I get the sense, had that coming together conversation recently in our global collaborations of how have we redefined our focus or shifted our focus. We've allowed our sort of international point of unity being a fairly strong license fundamentalism, rather than recognizing open data in the data spectrum in that wider sense in our sort of global conversations, I think, often. And I guess I'd say that's a challenge we need to take into D4D work, so D4D work and open knowledge work and others, of sort of allowing grey areas without getting lost in them becomes a sort of really interesting opportunity and threat and challenge for us here. I'm going to bring us to a close with one last round of moment for our speakers, and I will go back to alphabetical order for this on last names. So Renata, you're up first with any closing takeaway thoughts from.
Okay, Avila goes first. Typical. Like, back to the classroom of primary school, and going back to the classroom of primary school, when you're a little kid, this is all these possibilities, in the world to build different futures. And I think that my favorite toy back then was Legos. To me, open data is like the Lego to play with today's future. We can build so many things. This is the building blocks, really. And we are at such an early stage of what is possible, and what we could build together in the public interest, and play into the narrative that only the private sector, the private Silicon Valley sector, can build these amazing systems, digital infrastructure that will serve people, is what I want each and every person listen to this to reject. And when you're a little kid, you build something small and beautiful and celebrated, but that can scale, that can become, these little things that we build in communities, in collectives, in collaboratives, could scale to be the future we want. And I think that that's where I want to be working in the near future. Open data to the starting point, the models and the modeling that we are going to do with our organizations and communities is what is going to bring not only the solutions, but the spaces we want to live in, basically. And so is this architecture of the future enabled by open data what inspires me the most. And it wouldn't be possible with the very hard work of the initial work of opening it up and embracing it as a culture and as a design principle.
Thank you, Renata. And I think there's a fascinating story in there as well about how the lapsing of IP on Lego has led to just a flourishing of innovation in sort of both what Lego formerly are doing and all the other products that interoperate with it now and sort of make more things. But there's a really good theme there. Feng, your closing thoughts.
Well, yeah, I think to friends also who probably live in a developing country or a similar context like to China, I would say beyond the open data, we need more culture building in openness. And it's very important to let your friends who are not savvy in tech, who are not familiar with open source, open code, to understand the value of openness, starting from collaboration. I think that's the most easy part, but also towards participatory transparency. All those values could be born by the openness, to let them understand it, to make open become their normal standard in everyday life, how they work, how they behavior. And then that's the foundation for open data really plays a role in AI development in a digital world. So that's my final thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you, Feng. And Jenny.
I don't think I can really add to that. Honestly, I think Feng and Renata have covered everything that I would want to. So, in particular, the power of openness as a mentality rather than simply around assets, that as a way of working with each other, and also the real importance of community and of collaboration that that really unlocks. I think that those are the things that we can kind of cling on to and really exploit as we kind of go forward. They're things that we've learned from our open world that is still really, really relevant for the future.
So thank you once again to our panel, to everyone who's participated. I think that gives us so much food for thought as we rework the State of Open Data report and look really at where open data and AI are. But this is one of many chapters that are in that book, and 4 other chapters have sessions this week. So maybe as we come to a close, as panelists will disappear from the screen, but I don't know, Machiri, if you wanted to say any closing words and tell people about the other panels coming up this week, or if we just round off there. Thank you again to everyone who's taken part.
Thank you, team. Thank you, Renata, Jenny, and Feng. It's been a very enlightening session, and clearly we're off to the races on the refresh for the State of Open Data report. I'm looking forward to the updated content for the chapter on AI, given some of the insights that have come through today. So as Tim has mentioned, this was the first of 5, or a series of 5 roundtables we've now kicked off on. Please do join us tomorrow. We're starting off tomorrow. We have 2 sessions. We're starting off with the first session at different time zones here. Let me see if I can hit as many regions as possible. 1 p.m. Universal Time, which is 3 p.m. in Europe, 3 p.m. in Southern Africa, 9 p.m. in Manila. And our second session, and that'll be our Open Data and Gender session, chaired by Mo Rubinstein. And then we'll be back again at 5 p.m. Central African Time, or Central European Time, which would be 3 p.m. Universal Time for our Open Data and Climate Action session, which I got the time right. The conversions always get me sometimes, which will bring us to the end of day 2. So do keep a lookout for that. If you haven't already registered for the session, then you want to be part of those, please do go to the d4d.net website and register there. As always, the sessions will be live streamed, but if you can get in early and there are more slots, you'll be able to be in the room, which allows you to interact a little bit more than just on YouTube. We look forward to having you tomorrow. So whatever time it is, wherever you are, have a wonderful rest of your day.